It is delightful to be here. I've got a fair amount of material we're going to go through, but I know you're a quick crowd, and what we will cover, I've got a little table of contents and so forth. So, little IT help here, folks. There we go. All right, so here's where we're going. We have had a generation-long generation of prosperity, and what is so strange to me, looking out across the broad economy, is what has happened to corporate America, the FTSE 1000, the global economic world. They've been re-engineered, they've been right-sized, they've been Six Sigma'd, all of that. Not us. And all of a sudden we find that we are not immune. So this is what's going on in Scotland, right? It's a global trend. And there are just plain, there's no place for us to hide anymore. Peter Drucker, one of the great management theorists of the 20th century, perhaps the greatest, said that some theories of business are incredibly powerful, but all of them come to an end at some point. And I think that we are reaching the end of our running room. So here's what we're going to talk about this afternoon, and I think you'll see how one theme flows into the next. The legal sector in these trends are global. This is not an American problem. It's not an England and Wales problem. It's not a French or German problem. This chart shows the increasing correlation of global equity markets. It's done out of a financial research firm in Boston called State Street, and they show just that the markets are moving together. So the place to start from the economic perspective is excess capacity. Our industry has too many lawyers chasing too little work. In the States, it starts with graduates from law schools. This is a 10-year forward linear extrapolation of law school grads in the States versus jobs for lawyers. Now, never believe linear extrapolations, right? Because things always change. But if you buy this linear extrapolation, there will be 250,000 newly minted JDs in the next decade in the States who cannot find a job that requires a JD. It doesn't mean they'll be unemployed, it means they won't be lawyers. And you can see how the legal sector employment in the States is already beginning to shrink. And guess what the magic year when the curve turned was? It was coincident with the Great Reset. This morning, Richard said, we're looking to do more with less. Well, it's already happening. Legal work is getting done with fewer lawyers. So what happened? Well, it's not news to you that we're on the 5th year anniversary now of one of the most cataclysmic financial crises the globe has experienced in most of our lifetimes. And the problem is very simple. This is U.S. unemployment rate from the peak right before the recession in every post-World War II recession we've experienced. And you see that we are now the lucky people down at the red line that goes over to the right. Two observations about this chart. The first is, by the time we hit the trough in this recession, basically in every other post-World War II recession, we were done, right? We were back to square one, we were out of the recession. We had just basically hit the trough here. The other reason you may be asking yourself, well, why was this so bad and what does it mean for me? It was so bad because most recessions have been equity markets-driven recessions. This is a credit market-driven recession. And when the credit markets dry up, you might as well drain the oil from your car and try to go for a drive. It's just not going to be pretty. Why does this matter to you? Well, as one of my favorite managing partners likes to say, we cannot do better than our clients, not forever. This has led to permanent changes in the legal landscape, at least in the opinion of managing partners of many, many law firms. This is a survey a legal consultancy in the States takes every year. It has the virtue, whatever you think of its methodology, of being the same methodology, so you can get a time series of responses. And I want to draw your attention to the last bar that I outlined. You may not be able to read it. It says greater efficiency. Is greater efficiency a permanent change? And about 98% of the respondents thought it was a permanent change. But what's fascinating is they didn't even ask 4 years ago. It wasn't even on the radar. Legal Week asked people if they thought more large firms would fail near term, and the vast majority did. Here's one that's even wilder than that. 60% of the respondents were less than confident that their own firm would make it. I submit, never in the history of journalism about our industry would you ever have gotten results like that. Here's one of my favorite numbers. You can see I'm a big believer in data. This is RPL, or revenue per lawyer. This sample happens to be the American Lawyer 100 firms, but it's a sound data set, and you can see not one curve there, obviously, but two. So if you think about what this is, revenue per lawyer, it's basically the price that clients are willing to pay you to rent a solicitor for a year, right? And all of a sudden, they're willing to pay less. So here's the other side of that. This is another economic analysis firm in the States that actually uses real data from law firms' general ledgers and income statements. So this is not marketing speak. This is real data. And they call this demand growth by practice area. You can see they're all negative numbers, so that's a little bit of violence to the English language, but all of them are negative numbers, every practice area. And of course, there's more to come, right? We are not collecting as much money as we are billing. We are discounting in what we bill from the rack rate, the standard rate, and that trend has just accelerated in the last few years. This is actually telling us something very important. Clients are asking for and getting about 15% off on what we do. Now, if that were true in my business, I would take that to heart and wonder what they were trying to tell us. So, how are we responding? We're responding with what I call suicidal pricing. If you go back to your microeconomics, if you took it in college, as I did, there's something very powerful that happens in industries with excess capacity. They are ineluctably pushed to cut prices just to keep revenue coming in the door. It's this almost irresistible temptation. We see it in the airline industry every 5, 10, 15 years. You know, these new entrants arise, right? They rent some jets that are otherwise sitting in the desert in Arizona, and they start a new airline. They cut prices. The majors cut prices to match. Everybody loses money until finally some people are driven out of business, and they get back to sanity until they forget a decade later. So Warren Buffett did an analysis of the airline industry from its founding till a couple of years ago when he completed his analysis, and concluded that investors had put more capital into the airline industry than they had ever gotten back. It was a net suck of capital. So he announced this study under the headline, "I wish the Wright brothers had been shot down." So here's another industry that has, succumbed to suicidal pricing: department stores. We were taught not to go in the door unless it was 20, 30, 40% off. How did that turn out for you guys? Here's an incredibly simplistic law firm P&L statement, right? So you get 100 cents of revenue, 100 pence. About a third of that goes to pay people. About a third of that goes to everything else, your rent, your broadband connection, your electricity, your attendance at conferences, and that leaves about a third as profit. So that's great if you're collecting 100 cents on the dollar or 100 pence on the pound, but you're not. Let's say you go back to that chart I showed you earlier and you look and you say, well, we're collecting on average about 83 cents on the dollar. So that's a 17% drop in revenue. What happens? People still cost you about 33 cents. Space still costs you about 33 cents. And it cuts your profit basically by half. Here are a couple of scatter diagrams of the performance of some American law firms right before the Great Reset and right after. And I would ask you just to look at these, sort of put your eyes in soft focus, right, and go back and forth between these. So we had a nice tight distribution right before the Great Reset. Now the results are all over the place. Here's another way of looking at it. The tight cluster was 2000. The dots all over the place were 2010. In other words, we're seeing a greater dispersion of results than ever. And this means simply that strategy matters more than ever. Next, clients. We talk about demand and supply. We spent a bit of time on supply. Now this is the demand side. Clients have always had market power, I believe, but now they are exercising it in ways that we have not experienced before. And the efficiencies that we may generate are actually being captured by them, right? They're not going to increase our profits. They're being captured by clients. This morning, Richard talked about decomposing legal services, or I use the word disaggregating. This is a slide prepared by Deutsche Bank. I think we'd all agree they're a pretty sophisticated legal client. And they don't even get to lawyers until this symbolic risk gauge gets into the red zone. All of it is handled by compliance people or business people. Now, what is this, you're asking? I thought this was a law conference, not an automotive conference. Well, that is a picture of the rear view mirror of a BMW with the Harman Kardon speaker sound system in the door. Here's what's germane about that. Years ago, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Lexus, all of them said, you know what? There is no excuse for our making sound systems. Harman Kardon and Bose and JBL should be making sound systems. So they disaggregated that. They will never be in the sound system business again. Now what? There's been a lot of ink and pixels spilled on the question of whether we're a business or a profession. The short answer is we're both. So you can all go now? No. You do need to treat your business like a business. Yes, you have competition. You have other firms across town or, down south doing kind of what you do with kind of the same kind of people you have, charging, kind of based on your revenue. That's great. Hopefully you know how to compete with them. Here's the dangerous new thing. There are substitutes out there now for law firms. Substitutes in economics just means something else that serves, as far as the client's concerned, basically the same purpose. Tea or coffee, butter or margarine, oil or natural gas. And boy, in the States, are we seeing the substitution of natural gas for oil work itself out on a huge scale. And the thing about substitutes is clients, if they like the substitute, don't come back very soon. This morning, Richard talked about legal process outsourcers. He mentioned MacEwen, he mentioned Riverview Law. These firms are getting more and more sophisticated, and they are moving up the food chain relentlessly. Their global market impact, this is an estimate from a Magic Circle firm, is that their revenue is growing on average about 85% a year. You know, do that for a few years and see where you end up. And I heard these two quotes from a managing partner and the head of one of these firms within about 2 weeks earlier, and they both use the same ratio. For every one that the LPO gets, Big Law loses 3. If you want to put disruption, you know, on a T-shirt, I think that's it. Richard also talked about firms setting up captive centers, you know, on-sourcing, home sourcing, whatever. It's happening all over the industry. This is just a partial list. Firms are getting more professional management. McKinsey, which knows something I'd like to think about managing professional services firms, estimates the complexity of firms like yours in terms of management is 5 times as great as a retail wholesale trade establishment, meaning if you're a 50 million pound turnover firm, your management challenge is as complex as a 250 million pound something else. I'd mentioned strategies matter more than ever. Here's a game I suggest you play at home. Obscure the logo on a bunch of firms' websites and guess which firm is which. It's not that easy. They're indistinguishable. Now, how are we going to react to this? The short answer is I'm afraid we are not going to react well, but we're going to have to react because there is no entitlement to being the incumbents. Here's the turnover in the Fortune 30 firms through almost any randomly selected periods of 10 or 20 years. The late and unlamented CEO of A&P, which before World War II was kind of the Walmart of its day in the States. They had 16,000 stores. They owned food retailing in the U.S. Came face to face with the invention of these new things called supermarkets with wide aisles and bright lights and frozen food and fresh produce. And he said, we're sticking with our dark aisles and our limited selection because you can't argue with 100 years of success. We have had about 100 years of success. Let's look at another industry. This isn't any industry. This is just the FT's 10 most valuable companies by market cap across about a 10 or 12 year period. And you see the population changes. And here's how it changes, right? In 1998, 7 were US-based, 2 Japan, 1 EU, and that was it. Those were the only regions represented. By 2010, still 6 in the US. China came to 3 out of nowhere. Japan and the EU went away. And I know what you're saying or thinking, Bruce. Well, duh, of course. What do you think was going on in the global economy then? The answer is that's precisely the point. We are not immune from global forces. Here's another industry that thought it was the incumbent and it could be complacent, right? Because when Japanese cars first came to the States, they were rather pitiful performers. And Detroit decided to ignore them. That didn't turn out so well. Here's a statistic on the erosion of generational wealth, inherited wealth. It happens to be from the States, but it turns out that there's a phrase for this syndrome in almost every language. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, rice paddy to rice paddy. When you think you are comfortable, you are actually in a position of great peril. Azim Premji, one of the richest men in India, was interviewed by our TV host Charlie Rose a couple of years ago, and he has had an incredibly successful career. He's taken this company, Wipro, from nothing to 100,000 employees. He's very wealthy, very successful. Charlie Rose said, "What's your greatest threat?" He answered with a single word: complacency. So, this is what worries me. The psychology of lawyers is, I was going to say bizarre, it's unique. There's a psychological behavioral profiling test called the Caliper test. It's been taken by about 4 million white-collar professionals in the U.S., and it scores you on about 18 different traits. I've just listed the half dozen where lawyers are 1 or 2 standard deviations off the population, which is 50 by definition. So skeptical, we are off the charts in skepticism. You know, you got a new idea for me? Oh, I'll tell you why that's not going to work. Every single one of us is the smartest fellow in the room, right? And we are incredibly skeptical of change. Also, resilience. Look at that one. That basically describes your ability to cope gracefully with setbacks or failure, to bounce back. We don't bounce back, okay? We take failures hard, and we don't recover. This is almost un-American, right? What's the sin in America? It's not failing. The sin is failing to get right back up. So if you think lawyers are un-American, I might be tempted to agree with you. But it makes us very afraid of failure. John Maynard Keynes summed up the philosophy almost 100 years ago at this point. He was talking about bankers, but he said the way to get ruined is conventionally. Ruin yourself conventionally so that nobody can blame you. When it comes to change, you know, we just don't want to. But I submit that we're going to have to. And somebody who knows this market more intimately than I do apparently feels the same way. So what are we going to do? We have to be the optimists in Churchill's phrase. We have to stop being the pessimists. Let me do a quick detour into a very few concrete, quick things you could do this week. And I'm going to talk about client service. I'm going to go through this very fast, but I just want you to have a sense of capability. I'd like to think I'm a practical guy, right? And I want to show you a few things you can do. So Peter Drucker, again, used to stump MBA students with this question: what is the one thing every firm has to have? And they would say, capital, a product, employees. No, Drucker was looking for another answer, which was clients. The first thing every firm has to have is clients. So premium pricing is obsolete. Charging what the market will bear is obsolete. And I've got news for you. It's not your client's problem if you can't cut your costs in this world and maintain your profit. For you to be profitable is your problem. It is actually not your client's problem. So price based on value to the client, that changes the subject from this nasty discounting world we were in before to value. And I think that actually non-hourly billing, alternative fees so-called, can be our best friend, not just the client's best friend. I was an in-house lawyer for a decade at Morgan Stanley at Dean Witter in New York, And what did I do for 10 years? I rented securities lawyers, right? That's what I did. I went out into the market and rented securities lawyers. And I'll tell you what I loved, and conversely what I hated. I loved predictability. I hated surprises. And I think I would have paid more, maybe 15% more, if I could be guaranteed predictability. The problem with alternative fees is you actually have to manage your business. Richard alluded to project management before, and it's really actually very simple. If project management is a mystery to you, it shouldn't be. What you have to do is manage. Look at your costs historically. What does it, take to convey a piece of real estate? If your firm has done that 12 times, much less 1,000 times, you ought to know what it takes. So give your client an estimate. Don't say, I can't possibly estimate that. General Electric estimates the price of a nuclear power plant that's going to take 15 years to build. Here's Project Management 101. I'm not going to go into what this is, but pretend this was a dispute, all right? Imagine it's a dispute. So what's all the stuff happening up at the top at the beginning? It's probably you and your colleagues engaging in discovery and finding out what's going on. Once you've done all of that, you get down to a shorter but more intense spate of activity, which would be either a trial or the settlement negotiations, and then you wrap it up with closing documents. It's not a mystery. Here's another way of thinking about clients very quickly. More work, more consistent, less consistent. And think about your clients in that way. Think about your stars. Think about the loyal but less known clients. Research again and again into client relations shows the more touch points, the better. The more often people with your firm interact with that client, the better your odds of retaining them. Because if you don't actively retain clients, they will attrite. And the beauty and the curse of compound growth rates, this is a negative compound growth rate, is you're going to find yourself with very few clients in short order. Do you do things like, offer training at your office, take clients to dinner, maybe you've toyed with secondments? Think very carefully about what you're investing in. This is a McKinsey study, and it's charting the value of these, additional services to clients versus clients scoring us on how we do. So as a generalization, we do best on the things clients care least about, and vice versa. We're great at taking them to dinner and cricket matches, and they don't care about that. Ask yourself 2 questions with every engagement. At the start, ask, what would success look like? You may be able to answer that in a minute. It may take you half an hour. And if the answer is keeping the CEO out of the newspaper, well, then you know what you have to do. And at the end of every engagement, talk to the client. For heaven's sakes, don't assume that you know better than they do. You may not. Just ask them. But if you don't act on what you hear, don't do it. Here's another way of thinking about segmenting client service. Do you sell what you make? Do you make what is selling? Or do you try to solve the client's problem? One of my favorite managing partners says, what we try to do is see around corners for our clients. Now, that's easier said than done, obviously, but that's what you should be striving for. Okay. There was our detour into client service. I'm going to come back to what's to be done. The answer is we are going to take control of our firms and our destinies, or somebody else is going to do it to us. We're going to have to innovate, and we're going to have to give ourselves permission to fail, because when people innovate, and even when they don't, failure happens. Maybe you give people 1, 2, 3 get-out-of-jail cards a year, you know? You can have a bad idea. If it's plausible, if it doesn't work out well, you're forgiven. Or, when I was in college, I took way more science classes than I needed. I took physics, biology, chemistry, you know, you name it. And I was just curious about all of science. And of course, you know, I went to college long enough ago that probably everything I learned as a fact is almost obsolete, but I did take away the beauty and the clarity and the genius of the scientific method, because the scientific method tells us that we can learn from experiments that fail. This may be history's most famous failed experiment. About 150 years ago, physicists thought that the Earth and the solar system and the Milky Way and everything were traveling through this luminiferous ether. Okay, well, what was that? Well, nobody was quite sure, but it had to exist. So these two geniuses did this experiment with refracting light, and I won't go into it, but essentially they proved the ether could not possibly exist. Physicists were stumped for about 40 years until Einstein came up with the theory of general relativity. Well, so some failure, right? That was actually a brilliant, brilliant discovery. Here's an idea, talking about innovation. How about an R&D budget for your firm? All of your clients have one, I guarantee you. You know what 0.25% of revenue annually is? It's 20 hours on the year. It's nothing, but you could do something with it. Jeffrey Immelt, a rather famous CEO, tripled the R&D budget when he took over. He moved from 1 grand strategy to 1 per country. That's another great thing. Play with more options in more places. Put different tiny bets on the table and see what happens. I'm going to leave you with this. There's been a lot written in the business literature about disruption and what happens when innovative upstarts arrive, like the Japanese cars in the 1960s. And the short answer is most incumbent firms deal with it very, very badly, to the point where this curve is very famous in the literature. What happens to the incumbents when their business models are entirely mature and new ways of doing things come along? The short answer is most do very badly. I'll give you 2 examples from business history. Alexander Graham Bell, who we all know now, was an unknown when he went to Western Union Telegraph Company and offered to license his patent on the phone to Western Union. And they took a hard look and they said, no, our clients are perfectly happy with the telegraph. Why would they need anything else? Right? Western Union committed the classic fallacy. We know what's best for our clients better than they do. And if you think that kind of thing only happened 100 years ago, it happened more recently. A guy who ran a company called the Haloid Company took his patent to IBM and said, I have this new business machine, would you be interested? And IBM took a look at the carbon paper market and decided they were going to pass because this was really a substitute for carbon paper. And what was it? It was the Xerox machine. So we are challenged as incumbents, but there are reasons to hope that our industry is going to grow in the long run. The trend of globalization is here to stay. Ideas, people, talent, capital, cross borders, faster, more powerfully than ever before. Laws only get passed, they never get repealed. I said I was a securities lawyer. Dodd-Frank is 1,000 pages of securities law. Thank God I'm not doing that anymore. It will never be repealed. And these are reasons for us to hope for growth in the demand for legal services. But don't get confused. The demand for legal services is very different from who's going to provide the supply that's called for. Joseph Schumpeter is not my favorite economist. Guess 3 guesses who my favorite economist is, but he's a great economist. And he came up with the theory of creative destruction. Capitalism works through the genius of creative destruction. So we don't have, rest in peace, BlackBerries for much longer, but we have smartphones that are better. For that matter, we don't have mainframes. We have tablets that are better. You know, we don't have local coffee shops, most of which were filthy. We have Starbucks. We don't have American Motors. We have Lexus. This is the way capitalism works. Something better comes along. And, you know, being here, you know, birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment, I got to think, we've seen this before, you know? We can do this. We can take current reality and turn it into something greater and of much more value to our clients and to ourselves. We've done it before. If we don't do it for ourselves, somebody will do it for us. Thank you very much.
We have Costa coffee rather than Starbucks because Costa pay British taxes. It's a personal thing. Can I just ask you a question? When you're behind closed doors talking to leaders within law firms, what are the things they most say to you or ask you about? And what keeps them awake at night, would you say?
For years after the Great Reset, they said, when is it going to be 2006 again? I never hear that anymore. Now they say, look at my partners. They have their guns unholstered already to shoot down any change I suggest. What are we going to do? We have got to get these folks to deal with change. And here you see, this is the second answer to your question, a generational divide, okay? So if I'm talking to a fellow who's 50, 55 or above, he can say to himself, and his colleagues certainly say to themselves, the roof is not going to fall in before I get to leave the building. You know, steady as she goes. If you're talking to a 35 or 40-year-old and, hey, got news for you, they're the future of your firm, they want to know what's the plan. And this is true in the greatest firms in the world. It's true in the Magic Circle. It's true in the New York White Shoe Elite. It's true at Skadden Arps. It's true in, you know, you name it. What's the plan?
You talk exclusively about big law. What about people that work within relatively small law? Are they immune from all of this, or how long will it be before they are directly impacted with the same or similar factors that are affecting the legal profession?
The profession is being attacked from both ends, if you will. I have talked, because that's where the data is, and and working in a global consultancy, those are the firms you tend to deal with more. I have talked mostly about big law, but the small law firms have another threat that big law doesn't yet face on the same scale, which is more of what Richard was talking about this morning, They're threatened from below by technology, by commoditization, by, Richard didn't talk that much about what MacEwen does in depth. I know them very well. I've met with their CEO several times. It's an incredibly powerful firm, even though it's only 10 years old. This fellow, the CEO, will tell you, and he'll be quoted, our goal is to be the world's premier legal service provider in 10 years. And they have people, alumni from McKinsey, from the Boston Consulting Group, from IBM, from Amex, very, very accomplished executives who are doing nothing but optimizing the business processes involved in legal work. So every time you are going to acquire a public company, right, you should not really have to reinvent the wheel from scratch.
So they're industrializing it.
They're industrializing it. And, you know, you see this happen. When was the last time you had to call your cable phone or water company? You're going to spend 5 minutes punching numbers into your keypad because they have automated a process where you used to talk to a human being. They're going in the same direction. It's going to take a while, but as Richard said, technology is relentless. So the profession is being attacked from both ends, and particularly here and south of the border. The alternative business models that are going to be invented will be unlike the sight of, I think, anything we've ever seen. And if the U.S. thinks it can stop this at the water's edge, they are delusional. And I will tell them that every time they ask, and sometimes when they don't.
All right. Very, very briefly, do you think that the future is doom-laden, or do you think there are very real opportunities?
Very real. Very real. I mean, the demand for what we do is growing. I do believe that in a long-term sectoral way that will not be reversed. So people are going to need more and more of what we do. Simply, the world is getting more complex, not simpler. That's great for us. The question is, will we have the perspicacity, the agility, the nimbleness to supply that growing demand? Or is somebody else going to do it? It's not going to go unmet.
So you've been told. Bruce, thank you very much indeed. Round of applause for Bruce MacEwen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.